Well, I'm delighted to say we can speak to David now. And David, just, and sadly, we haven't seen the whole film yet, but just hearing the voices of those remarkable ladies there, it stops you in your tracks a little bit about what they went through then and how they carried on regardless.
Yeah, and I think you have to remember that these are very young women who've made an astonishing decision. They've just decided to leave their homes, to travel thousands of miles, to take on an extremely difficult job, very difficult training, very difficult conditions, and to do so in many cases because of belief in this thing called the NHS and the idea of healthcare for all. So I think when you think about the scale of the decision they made, the sacrifices that they were willing to make, and then in many cases their treatment, there's a terrible mismatch there, isn't there?
And the fact is, I mean, there was this phrase, with one hand, morning, by the way, David, with one hand they were healing, and with the other they were fending off discrimination, and as we heard, violence as well, you know, that in the form of violence and very, very offensive, angry words. And I just wonder how much care was taken for them by the institutions at that time, because the NHS needed them.
Well, I think one of the big breakthroughs of recent years and recent months is the idea that many people agree with now that the job of combating racism and discrimination is not the job of just people of colour alone. But of course, that attitude wasn't there in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s when these nurses were training, when they were coming to Britain, when they were starting their careers. And so I think the presumption was that they just needed to get on with it. Racism was just a fact of life, and that it was their issue and they had to deal with it, and that there was very little support.
Did it surprise you at all? My parents were nurses. I've heard stories like this, but did it surprise you at all?
It didn't. I mean, I've spoken to lots of nurses for other projects and over the years, and have heard about those early decades in the NHS. I think what surprised me is how many people, doctors and nurses from the Caribbean, from Africa, from the Indian subcontinent, came to Britain, not because as we often imagine, because they wanted to be British, they wanted to live here. They came to Britain because they'd heard of this thing called the NHS, and they'd heard of this almost miraculous phenomena where people were treated not based on how much money they had, but on the need they had for medical care. And that people from all over the world came to Britain to be part of the NHS because they believed in the principles of the NHS. And I think when you realise that this story of what the NHS is being told all over the world, and that thousands of people have come here to be part of it, I think you realise just how special the NHS is.
David, I just wonder if you, to what extent you could bring this up to date, in as much as some things haven't changed, have they? The NHS still relies on people coming here from elsewhere to make the service work. That's still the case now.
Well, we've never generated the number of doctors and nurses and ancillary staff that we would need to run the NHS. And in some ways, that's not entirely surprising. The NHS is not just the biggest employer in Britain, it's the biggest employer in Europe. It's 1.2 million people. And of that 1.2 million, 14% are from overseas or are minorities. They come from 200 different nations. It is an incredibly international national health service. And it's always been that case from its inception to the present day. It's just needed to draw people in from all over the world. And that story of immigration, the most vexed political issue of recent decades, and the story of this most beloved national institution are intertwined. They are the same story. I always like the symmetry. Sometimes history rhymes. Sometimes there's little patterns. And I think it's really significant that there are 12 days between the arrival of the Windrush in 1948 and the first day of the NHS. Historically, they are twins.
It's ironic, isn't it, when you see the story come round full circle, you know, when we're having conversations about Brexit and foreign workers and the arguments about immigration, it hasn't gone away.
It hasn't. I don't think we've ever understood our relationship with immigration. I don't think we've also ever fully understood that that's half the story. There's also emigration. One of the reasons Britain and the NHS have been unable to fill the posts within the service is because historically British doctors and British nurses trained in British universities, when they graduated, have gone to work in the United States or Canada or Australia and have not wanted to work in the NHS. So the reason for bringing people from all over the world is partly because of emigration. And that aspect, that side of the coin is almost never discussed. And it's critical to understanding the NHS and post-war Britain.
David, can we talk about the football on Sunday? I'm not sure if you watched the match, and I'm not sure how you felt about it when it finally went to penalties. You are obviously very aware of the fallout now because of the disgusting abuse that's been levied at 3 of the black penalty takers. What's your response to how we, as a nation, politically as well, are responding to this abuse?
Well, I did watch the match. I was writing an article for a newspaper for the next day, and I watched the penalty misses, and I realised, I had my laptop on my knee, I realised that everything I'd written, all of my notes, were irrelevant because it was obvious what was going to happen. It was just, I think everybody, millions of people, particularly black people, knew the moment those penalties were missed what was coming. And in some of its inevitability is extremely depressing. But I think I find more depressing is that the opportunities for politicians to condemn this 4 weeks ago when the tournament began wasn't taken. And I think politicians have to take some blame in what happened. Most British governments have found it within their heart to condemn racism since the 1960s. And at this critical moment, our politicians didn't.
I dare say, David, a lot of people will be thinking, if you were trying to look for a positive out of that fallout that came after it, you might be thinking, because it was so high profile, because it was a sporting event, because of everything that happened afterwards and how ugly that is, that it might be a time when it focuses the mind. For whatever reason, for politicians, maybe because they hopefully want to do the right thing, and in reality because it is the right thing to do, that something might change. Do you think, I mean, you're a historian, do you think historians like you might look back in the future and think, do you know, that thing happened and we saw something very ugly, the response afterwards, and it might be a kind of a turning point?
I think we're living through a process, not an event. And I think the events of last summer, the Black Lives Matter protest, the toppling of statues, I think they're all part of a process that isn't an instant thing. It's going to take years to play out. And I think this football team are going to play a critical role in it. Their average age is around 25. They're going to be playing for England for the next decade. And they are who they are. And they've told us who they are. And they've told us what their priorities and their beliefs are. And they are incredible in their togetherness. And they are going to play, I think, a critical role in this transformation that we are going to have, because it's about demographics and about generational change in our relationships to race. And politicians can do whatever they want and they can try to exploit it or manipulate it. But this is what's happening, because this is, and they represent the voice of a generation who wants to have these discussions.